So we just start relatively simply with your name and job title.
Okay, I'm Diane Pennington, and I'm a lecturer in information science at the Department of Computer and Information Science at the University of Strathclyde.
Can you explain your research to me?
Right, so my research goes in a couple of different areas. One is in the area of emotional information retrieval, which is looking at how people might want to interact with things online by emotion. So that if we think about how we might want to find a song that makes us in a good mood on a Friday afternoon, or something that makes us feel more awake on a Monday morning, or can help us with even health problems like depression, what we can do to help people find things in ways that are different from how we have things currently, which is just basically we type in some keywords, we hope that something comes back based on those words, but that's the only way that we have to find things currently. So thinking about how we might be able to make connections with things emotionally or in other ways that more meet a different kind of information need other than just typing in the name of a song or a title or a picture of a dog. Maybe we want to see a dog that's smiling, or things that look different. And this is especially interesting in my area, which is non-text retrieval. So things like images and videos and music and things that are not in textual format are actually harder to search, because the only way that we have to search currently is by a word, but those things are not words. And so there's a translation that has to happen between a word that we type in and an image or a piece of music. And that doesn't always work very well. So we can search the full text of a text document through Google, but Google can't search an image the way that it can index and search a text that exists. So there's some really unique situations that we can look into. My other area is in health information, and more specifically how people can find health information that is both useful and engaging as well as reliable.
How does it work practically? So could you talk through a scenario and how it would be employed, starting with the emotional information?
Right. So if we think about, like if I go back to an idea that I studied in postgraduate school with my first advisor, where he was looking at similarity of images, and it was based on the visual content of the information. So we were working with things like space photographs and NASA images and things like that. So we could get photos that were visually similar based on the fact that this one has the International Space Station in it. So that can help us retrieve images that also have the International Space Station, or things that are similar in color and shape and so on. But there's a lot of work that is being done in that area in computer science, but the problem is that it doesn't really yet connect semantic meaning to it. So we can get things that have something in that's round, or something that's black, or something that has this sort of texture. But one thing that I'm finding in my research is that I'm starting to find patterns in things like happy pictures. So if we say happy picture, it has bright colors in it. Sometimes the sun is shining, cute children, cute animals, people smiling, people in love with each other. A lot of these different kinds of facets that we're finding, if we can make those connections between those things, then it'll be easier, hopefully, to find things that produce or communicate positive affect. And the problem, though, is that it's not universal, but we can base it on, first of all, the facets that we're finding where there is agreement. And then if we have people participating in sort of, voting and commenting and rating and all those things that people already like to do online, it'd be great to be able to leverage that. And some of my colleagues and I are already working in that area to try to say, well, here's sort of a baseline of, these are happy pictures. So what else can we gather from other people to vote on them and say, how does this make you feel? What emotion to you is conveyed? What emotion do you feel when you look at this? So it is going to take sort of collecting both collective ideas as well as individual preferences, basically, to make these systems work. And unfortunately, they don't exist yet, but that's what we need to work on, is how to get all of these different pieces of research together and create user interfaces that will allow us to do these things.
I guess does culture have a big effect on how people respond emotionally?
It does, and there's a lot of cultural differences. I think most of my work so far is focused on Western culture. Even colors in different cultures can mean something different. I believe it's something like white color represents death in China or something like that, where we wouldn't associate that. We always think of Black being associated with death in Western culture. And also just the interpretation of a photo can be very different. There was a famous photo after 9/11 happened in the States, and you could see the World Trade Center was still burning in the background. And across the water, there was a group of people sitting around. And that picture was put into the newspaper, and people thought that it was disrespectful because they looked like they didn't care about what was happening right behind them because they were sort of sitting in a circle and talking, when in fact, when they talked to the people in the picture, they were discussing, what is the future of our lives going to look like now that this has happened to our city. So a lot of misinterpretation and different interpretation can happen based on the information that you have about what's in a document, whether it's a picture or an image or whatever. And all of these things can really influence how we interpret them and how they make us feel when we work with them. When I was doing my PhD, I did a lot of reading in cognitive science and psychology because I really feel like systems, the internet, databases, whatever, need to be designed so that they work with the way we already think. And the problem is that a lot of people who make systems don't consider that, like they're only concerned with the technology. So it works and I like it and it seems cool, so we're done. They don't consider that part of how people sort of categorize information naturally in their minds, or how it makes the most sense to have it presented. And I teach a lot of stuff in that area. So it doesn't really work very well all the time. And I think that's part of the problem with accessing information, is that we don't consider how the brain works and try to work with that. We're trying to impose another system that a techie created. They didn't really think about how users will actually interact with it or how our brains work or any of that. They just sort of well, let's make it work. And I think that's a problem with a lot of our systems. And therefore, sometimes we don't really tell the system what we want, but that's all the system can ever do, is tell us what we tell the system, but we have to work in the system's terms to be able to get anything out of it. And sometimes people don't know how to work with that. The way we would naturally request something is sometimes very different from the best kind of Google search, where if you just focus on the major words in a query that you have, that's not necessarily how we would talk. If we wanted to say, what is the closest Starbucks to the University of Strathclyde, and we type that question in, Google's trying to learn how to facilitate those kinds of natural language questions a little bit better, but sometimes it doesn't work as well as just doing it the long way and going to the Starbucks website and typing in your postcode and hoping that it will show up something that is the closest way. But with things like voice searches that Google is doing and that Apple is doing and so on, and Microsoft, they're trying to get to where things are more natural. But once again, it's still just factual information. You can't just say to Siri, hey, Siri, give me a song that'll put me into a better mood. You have to sort of ask specifically for what you're looking for. And sometimes that's the hardest part of doing a search, is telling it what you want and telling it in terms that it can understand. And that's the part that I think the computers can't really bridge yet, is getting past that point of what's actually going on in our brain and what we're thinking, and putting it out into the system and getting back what we actually are thinking of. Because sometimes we don't even know what it is until we find it. So how do you tell it what you want if you don't even know what it is?
Sorry, we were talking about mental health.
Right.
So about self-diagnosis.
Right. So if you know that you're feeling bad, and you need something to help you feel better, and how do you deal with that? Like if you have some sort of anxiety disorder and you have a panic attack, 3 a.m, what do you do? Right. So part of our hypothesis with looking at mental health online is that when things have sort of a stigma attached to them, especially, people will go online because they can be anonymous. And I don't like generalizing between genders, but one thing that other people are saying they're finding is that women will seek social support through online health and so on, and men will just look for information. So they'll watch a video about depression rather than finding a depression forum and going to talk to other people about it if they're anonymous. But if you're trying to self-diagnose yourself, whether it's depression or any other health condition, and you can convince yourself that you're dying because you're like, well, I've got these symptoms, and oh my gosh, I must have HIV. I must be getting cancer, when really you just have a little virus or something. And people do this. They bring this into their GP. They've got a printout. They're saying, this is what I have. I'm dying. You've got to treat me for cancer. No, the GP has to really work with patients in a different way now, because in a way patients are more empowered, you might say, or they're better informed, or they have a lot of things available to them. But even if they have a diagnosis and they go to a page that's not reliable or is not a good place to look, they might think that there's some kind of miracle treatment, which is just a complete waste of money. And they'll say, oh, I need to go buy this thing or this magic herb that'll fix me. And that's not really true either. But at the same time, the pharmaceutical companies are very good at hiding that their websites are based on a particular pharmaceutical. So they could look for depression online and have an antidepressant be the first result that is returned, not necessarily saying that antidepressants are good or bad, but they have a way of communicating about their drug sort of indirectly to make the patient think that this is the best medication for me and I need to go ask my doctor to give me this particular antidepressant. Even before they've been diagnosed sometimes, if they're just looking for something. And so they know how to code their sites better. One thing that we see when we're working with youth is that they don't use sort of like the official medical terms for things, and they don't frequently know what it means. We've done focus groups with 12 to 14-year-olds, and they'll say, well, what do you think mental health means? And they'll say something like the slow kids. So they think of kids who are, have a different issue than having a depression, anxiety, or schizophrenia. But when we ask them to do searches for things, we'll give them scenarios about mental health or just, see how they would work with finding this kind of information. And they'll type in things like, my life sucks. They won't type in depression or anxiety or some sort of official diagnosis. And then the issue exists as well of, if you say, I'm depressed, are you truly clinically depressed and you need treatment? Or are you just depressed because you got a low mark on an exam? And we use these terms very casually sometimes, and we don't really mean them. One thing that I find offending personally is people joke about Alzheimer's and dementia, like, oh, I forgot to bring something with me to work. I must be getting Alzheimer's. Personally, I find that offensive because my father died of dementia, and it's a very serious thing, and it's a growing issue throughout the world. I think it's like something like 90,000 people in Scotland have it, I believe, this point. So it's a growing, yeah. So if people are just joking, oh, I'm schizophrenic, oh, I have dementia, like that's part of the stigma around mental health conditions, is that people joke about them in a way that sort of makes light of them when they're really serious situations that can lead to, there's no cure for dementia. The only end result is death. With depression, people can commit suicide. They can have really bad effects on their lives. And so when people joke about it, it really does make light of serious situations. But then you find those people online as well that are joking about things, or you have people that act that way on, Facebook posts. Donald Trump has been identified as a narcissist by psychiatrists. So, they've said, oh, he's got all the classic symptoms. And so people are, on the other side of things, are playing on this. Like, do we really want somebody who thinks it's all about him to be the president of the United States? But the point is that these people can get together and talk about this. And then there's a lot of wars going on that people are supporting Trump and saying, oh, he's a great man. He's really just all about fixing America. And then the Democrats are saying he's a narcissist. He just cares about himself and wants to spend his money to show off and say that he can do it. So that's potentially, another damaging mental health conversation that's going on now.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about your father, actually, because it's really interesting what you were saying. So
yeah,
if you could give a bit of a background on him and sort of you growing up.
So my father, right? So he was probably the biggest influence of any person in my life. He passed away of dementia in 2010. He was only 67. And he was one of the smartest people I've ever known. He was one of the original computer nerds. So obviously he had a lot of impact on me because here I am, modern day computer nerd. He started working with computers in the 1960s. He was hired as a computer programmer for General Motors in Detroit, Michigan, I lived in St. Louis, but originally we're from Detroit. And he started in the mailroom after he left the American Army, was discharged from there, got a job in the mailroom, and got promoted eventually to be a computer programmer. Spent the rest of his career working with GM in the computer world. He used to bring home punch cards for me and I used to draw on them and play with them, and they were just sort of laying around the house. And that old style of printer paper that had the holes on the sides that you had to tear off, the dot matrix printer paper, he used to bring that home. And so he brought our first computer home in 1981 when I was 6 years old. And we started learning how to program it. And that was when I learned my first programming language, when I was that young. And we would get these magazines that we subscribed to, and they had lists of computer code. So we would take turns typing in the code, and one person would read it and the other person would type it in. And we'd sit there and debug it, and they would usually be the end result of a game or something that we could play together. We spent hours doing this when I was a kid. And so we got our first PC in the late 80s, which was, much earlier, obviously, than most homes. And so it's had an impact on my career, obviously, kind of the direction that I've taken. I have found that sometimes it's hard for me to get credibility, maybe at the level that I deserve it, because I have been working with computers for so much of my life. But when people see the age group that I'm in, it's not like the current age group that we've grown up with computers. And if you think about the average 18-year-old and how, if they were born in 1998 or so, they've really never known much of their life without having technology around at this level. But for somebody of my age, it's really unique for me to have been working with computers for so long. So when my father started getting sick with dementia, it started affecting his job, and he got fired. Basically, he was sacked for what they said he didn't have any memory left, and sent him home one day. And the story from my mother is that the security men walked him out and made her come pick him up. And they watched him leave with his things, and he was no longer had what had been so much of his identity, which was his work. And he was just kind of left to decline from there because there was no treatment. There's nothing that can really be done at this point to even slow it down. And he didn't have Alzheimer's. People always think of like sort of the stereotypical dementia patient as somebody who has Alzheimer's, which is a different thing from what he had because it affected a different area of his brain. And he was otherwise in great physical health. He was a runner. He was very active. He had nothing else wrong with him. And so as his brain continued to decline, it got very difficult physically for everyone to take care of him because he could easily get around and get into things that he shouldn't get into because he could still walk. He could still, obviously very, very active. So it wasn't like you think of a 90-year-old dementia patient with Alzheimer's who's stuck in the bed of a care home. It wasn't like that for him until he got to the very end where his body just kind of gave up and he stopped eating. He couldn't move. But what was so interesting about it was because he had this sort of engineering mind, and you would watch him try to work out something. Even if I gave him a technology, if I gave him an iPod, I was hoping that maybe he loved listening to music that he remembered from when he was younger, and he could always sing the words of a song, even when he couldn't tell you what day it was. He could always sing along with the music and recognize it and, drum along with it. And that was really great to see him come back when he would do that. And so that was one way that the technology, whether it was an iPod or the radio in my car or whatever, would help enable him to do that. But when you watched him work out other things in his head, everyday events, like how to eat something, like, do I use the knife or do I use the fork? Or, the fork doesn't work with the soup. Where's my water glass? He would try to sit there and try to work through this problem and try to rely on the engineering brain that he had, but it just wasn't working the same for him anymore. So it was so interesting and tragic to watch how somebody who was a pioneer of computers and had just had so much in his mind all the time, be able to get his life to the point to where eventually he couldn't feed himself. He couldn't go to the toilet by himself. He couldn't do anything until eventually he was just left in a bed in a nursing home to pass away. But we always did things like play music for him or show him pictures of the past, and he would respond to them less and less, especially at the end, but he would always be able to connect with something that he saw. There's been some work in that information can be held in a particular object. This is an idea I've actually started to work on recently. Like, we can hold on to an object. You'll see a lot of dementia patients, like women, will hold on to dolls or toys because it reminds them of when they were a child or when they had their own babies. And so it brings them back to an earlier time in their life, but it's very comfortable for them. So bringing objects or music or things into their lives that are connections to them to when things were better in their life is actually something that's very comforting to them. So when we look at things like music therapy and dementia, it's very, very effective, that they will come alive. There's been some prototypes, information systems, where there's one in particular that's really cool. It's like a touch screen, and they can make music with it. And there's actually a bit of affect where you can touch a face, like a happy face or a sad face or an okay face, and that will affect what type of music it creates. And they can draw their finger around on the computer screen, and it will make music come out. So they're making music, and the people who are with them, if there's other dementia patients, will be dancing around and enjoying themselves, and the system is programmed so that the music never sounds bad, whatever they do. And so that's a really interesting approach to thinking about how information can make us feel better. At this point, it can't cure dementia, but what we really want to try to do with people is make that part of their lives as comfortable and as pleasant as we can. And that's one way that I've seen, both in the research and just in my own life, how much of a difference that can make. And it's one of the things that motivates me to try to work on these problems and make them better.
Well, maybe we should move on to these questions, because we've got 10 minutes.
Oh,
well,
yeah.
9 minutes, actually. And how do you think we'll be able to manage ever-increasing quantities of data globally? And, what impact do you think that will have?
Like from a technical perspective, or?
Yeah,
Relational databases, are, if you've heard of them or seen anything about them so far in your research for this project. So relational databases, I've got a book on them right there. Relational databases are how data has originally been stored for the last 40, 50 years or so. And so those are things that are stored like in tables, so you can just think of like rows and columns, right? And so if you think about how a spreadsheet looks in Excel, and there's rows and columns, database tables kind of look like that. And so each table has like a field and so you can hold little pieces of data, and it's organized in a very complicated scheme so that the tables are related to one another and they have relationships between them, and they hold all of these kinds of information. So a lot of data for years has been stored that way. A lot of databases run on the back ends of websites that store all of the information that we interact with on a website. So that has been the model for a while, and it still continues to exist. The problem is that the processing power gets complex. The more data we have, the more it has to process. And then it used to be, even a few years ago, I used to run, I was a library systems administrator, so I ran, among other things, the database that held everything that happened in this big university library. So it included, everything that the library holds in terms of the books and all of the items, circulation data, what was being purchased, where it was located, all of the information about the patrons, the students and faculty who checked out books. Everything is stored in this database, and it all integrates and it all works together. It shows what's displayed in the catalog when you search the library catalog. But it used to take so long to process it that sometimes if I had a specialized query that management or something wanted some information out of the database that wasn't available through the client, that I'd have to write a query for it in what's called structured query language, which is just the standard language for getting things out of relational databases. And I'd start the query running, go home for the night, Sometimes I come back the next morning, it was still running. Because there were so many relationships and ways that tables had to be joined together and so on, that it took a really long time to run. So that's not acceptable on the web, so that we can't have all these things taking hours and hours overnight. People would quit using the web if we had to wait that long. So they've been working with different ways of storing and retrieving data for the past 15 or 20 years. And so there's formats like XML, which stands for Extensible Markup Language. So you can create it so that the structure of it will fit your data, because there's different types of data and different relationships and so on. So they're actually stored in just plain text files, but they're stored in a markup language, extensible markup language. That's what I meant to say, sorry. So it's similar to HTML. HTML is the language that is the display language that allows things on the web to be displayed, and it's marked up, and that's how we see what we see in the browser when we look at it. But XML is meant for data storage and transmission. So people have been working with these things more and more, and it has the capability of being processed faster and stored in more efficient ways, because they're just stored in like these flat, plain text files rather than complicated relationships. And then you can query them in different ways and get information back faster. So they're starting to look beyond the relational database model and into XML, and that's when you can get into the big data stuff, and that's how big data can be harvested more quickly with these newer kinds of technologies that they're trying to find to store lots and lots of data. So they're finding that the relational model, which worked for a while, but they were usually in sort of these closed systems where they only existed within a company or an organization or something. And then, so it wasn't as complicated as when you have a website where you have millions of users logging in and wanting their details and wanting to buy things and all that. So they've been trying to work with different kinds of technologies. But the interesting thing about it is that as the technologies have gotten to work faster and sort of more streamlined, that I think what's actually happened is that there's fewer experts who can actually program this stuff. Because it used to be that anybody could, have Microsoft Access at home and play with it, and people who really wanted to would make, databases out of their, whatever films they have at home or their books or whatever, and that's fine for like a home setting for people who really wanted to play with it. But now there's been like this shift, I think, in who's doing what, because there's less need to develop things because people are just reusing models and structures that already exist. And so you have fewer and fewer people knowing this stuff, and it's become more and more specialized. A lot of the students that come in here into the computer science program, like all they want to do is learn to code. They don't care about anything else. They don't care about users. They don't care about the impact of technology. One of my colleagues teaches undergrad computer science students a course on internet ethics, and they didn't come to class. They're not interested in the ethical issues. They just want to code. So you're seeing that you just have the people who just want to code. When I was a coder, I was bored because there was so much more to it. And that was one of the reasons I left IT and came into information science, was because just sitting around coding all day was not that interesting. That's not the interesting part of technology to me. It's how the people interact with it and all these other things that we've been discussing. But so the people that just want to code. So if they have to write a paper or think about bigger issues, they don't want to talk about it. So I think that comes back to the problem that I was talking about earlier with how things don't really work well for users, is because the guys that just want to code would rather just like sit behind their computer all day and write code and never talk to anybody, never do anything else. It's sort of your stereotypical IT kind of person really would rather stay away from people as much as possible. You have to wonder, like, what is next from where we are now? Because all of this has changed so quickly. Like, if you think about where we were 20 years ago with all this and where we are now, like, different worlds, right? And so where are we going to be another 20 years if we think that we've moved along this quickly, kind of basically the biggest, or maybe the second biggest, maybe after the invention of the printing press, the second biggest revolution in technology and information is happening in our lives. So where is this going to go 20 years from now? That are we going to be at that point? Are we going to have implants that that possess all of these things that spin around in our minds, and the things we try to forget and the things we want to remember more? Like, what's going to happen exactly? How is that going to affect? What is information retrieval going to mean for us by then that now we have these phones that we carry around. It used to be computers took up an entire room, right? Then now a laptop's too big for people. They just want to carry around their little phone. So things just keep getting smaller and smaller and more efficient that you have to wonder, where is that going to go from here? And that is a little scary. When we start to talk about the convenience of doing everything online, I have to admit, I get a little depressed by that, because is it to the point to where, we can just stay on our phones and play games and talk to people and order takeaway and do everything else that we do just because it's convenient to do it online, that pretty much all we're going to need to do is, sit in place and have everything come to us and never have to come out. I remember it was like the late 90s or early 2000s maybe, that there was a guy in the US that was trying to prove a point. He didn't leave his house for an entire year, and he did this as a demonstration to show that he could do anything that he needed to do through the internet. So all he had was an internet connection and had stuff ordered to his house. He didn't have to go out to buy food. Everything came to him, and he worked from home. Like, he did everything right there at his desk. So is that really what we want for our lives? I mean, again, I think this balance is important of figuring out, there's lots of ways that it can enrich our lives. Being 5,000 miles away from my family, technology makes it so much easier for me to stay in touch with them. But that doesn't mean that, I want to just stay in place and teach class from my house and never really have to come to campus, because part of what makes my job so interesting is being able to interact with my colleagues and my students every day. But if all I did was sit in a room and type, and that was the way I ever did, and some people do that, I've done that before with online teaching, it's just not the same. There's just something that human element that we can't replace, or at least technology doesn't let us do it. It's come a long way, but we can't really replace, sitting down here in my office and having this talk, or going for a coffee, or, whatever, that sort of thing. I just don't know if it's there. I don't know if it'll ever be there. Maybe we'll find out in 20 years.
And I'll roll these last two questions into one thing. Is what happens if there is no means to order and observe data? Does it exist? And also, what would a universe without data be like?
If there is no means to order?
Yeah.
Well, I think that there's a couple of things in there that...
Do you have to go?
I'm fine. It's 1:53, but I have a meeting at 2. I should be all right.
Okay, this is the last question.
Yeah. So, no, I think... Well, when I talk to students about information, and we think back to, even 50 years ago, before we had computers, there's sort of libraries as a history, and there's information science as a history, which used to be called documentation. And documentation came out of World War II, actually, including all of the nasty experiments that Nazis did on people. And they created all this scientific data. Documentation developed as a discipline as a result of trying to deal with all this data that was created in World War II, which was really interesting. But then libraries came out of a completely different tradition, including Melville Dewey, who's kind of one of the big men who created the Dewey Decimal System, which is the classification numbers they use in libraries, and he created that. And it's awful that we've come from that, because his view was that women were only smart enough to implement his system, but they would never be smart enough to create their own classification system. So he employed lots of women and apparently based them on their attractiveness rather than their ability to do anything intellectual. But that's a whole different story. So when we think back to how we dealt with information, in history, before computers, before documentation or information science, that we had data, but it was never central to our lives the way it is now. If we needed to know something, we've always had data just by knowing people and knowing each other and asking people we know how to do something. But I think that it existed in such a smaller format in so many different ways. I think we've always had data. You can go back to caveman days when they wrote messages on walls, the little pictures, that was still data. We've always had methods of communication. That's always been a fundamental strength of not just humans, but the entire animal kingdom. I know my dogs bark at me all the time. I don't know what they're saying all the time, but they're communicating. They're transmitting some sort of data to me. It's usually that they want to go outside or they're hungry, but they're trying to, that's data that they're passing to me that they want me to turn into some sort of information. And we can't always figure out what that is, whether it's from an animal or another language or some sort of computer thing that we don't always all understand. But I think data has always existed. I think it's just part of the nature of, being alive, that even, plants transmit some sort of information, like they need to get sunlight, and so they have their own methods of doing that. Like, it's just fundamental to the world. So I can't imagine a world without data, because I don't think it exists, because we've always been communicators in some way. Everything is. But we're communicating data, and then it's the receiver's job of the data to turn it into information and hopefully process and do something with it. So I don't think it's possible.
Right.
Is that too fatalistic?
No. Why do you think I'm making this film?